From Melrose Arts, this is Art in Action, a series of live art demonstrations by prominent local artists. Working before an audience, the artists describe their process and answer questions about their technique. They show you their approach to art in a very personal way. From the art of encaustic, reverse painting on glass, fiber art, and calligraphy, it's all here. Sponsored by Melrose Arts, a volunteer group dedicated to encouraging the visual arts in Melrose. These monthly art demos are open to the public and free of charge. Today on Art in Action, pastel artist Jeanne Smith shows us how to create a dynamic wave painting in pastel. Jeanne begins with a strong underpainting and then builds the painting on top. A lifelong artist, Jeanne discovered pastel 15 years ago and loves its velvety richness and pure colors.
I'm going to do a wave painting demonstration today, and I thought I would start with I thought about sketching it out ahead of time, and I thought, no, it's probably better to start with a completely blank piece of paper the way I usually start. Just a little bit about the materials. I start with a piece of sanded paper. I always work on sanded paper, which means it has a pretty good grippy surface to it. I mount it onto a piece of gator board so it's a nice rigid surface, and that way I can just pop it into a frame pretty easily. I don't need to worry about it warping, and I use a wet underpainting, which you'll see, and then I don't have to worry about the paper buckling at all. It stays really flat, which is one reason I like to mount it. I have tried painting waves plein air, and I find it very frustrating because they really don't hold still. They're even worse than children. So I find it's best I like to do a lot of field research at the beach. Stand there, and I'm not kidding about this, just standing there in close observation of how the waves move. And depending on the time of day, the kind of weather that we've had recently, the way the waves are crashing, the kind of surf you have, the waves behave differently, they look differently. And so really close observation of the kind of geometry you see in the waves, the way the light's hitting, the way they break up, getting to know that really well. So really close observation as an artist is different than just going on vacation at the beach. So really looking at how the foam breaks up, really getting to understand that. You have to spend a lot of time watching and looking at it. I always do a thumbnail sketch, even if I like the crop that I've done. I've actually cropped this photo and straightened it out. It's very hard for me to get, when I take a picture, get a straight horizon line. I usually have to straighten out the horizon line for my pictures for some reason. So these are all equal. And that just made it, what I did was I created the same reference points on here. So it's sort of a grid. And then when I do my sketch on here, I can easily transfer it and blow it up to a larger size there. So first thing I'm going to do is just draw my thumbnail on here. When you're choosing a composition for a wave painting, you want to look for large lines that work well. What I really like about this is the color in here and this sense of real power and movement here, and then this kind of spreading out of water. And then I really also like the wet sand and the dry sand. I like the span of different colors and the action going on. And then also this flat, there's such a great variety of the different kinds of foam in here, and that's what I wanted to capture, is the kind of tumble of these waves and the variety of movement. It's always a good idea when you're starting a painting to know why you're doing it, because paintings take a long time and a lot of effort and thought and planning. So it's really a good idea, no matter what you're painting, spend a few minutes thinking, what am I doing this for? What's the inspiration? You have to have a main point in your painting. There has to be a reason why you're saying, why are you telling me this? Why is this important? Why should I read it? Why should I look at your painting? So it's the same thing. You need to have a reason. What's your inspiration? So if you can ask yourself that whenever you're painting, what is it that makes you want to use this photograph? Or what makes you want to paint this scene out in front of you? If you can answer that, then when you get stuck in the middle of your painting, not knowing what to do next, you can always go back to that. It's sort of like when you get lost in the middle of writing a paper. Where was I? What was I trying to say? If you go back to that thesis statement, oh, I know what I was trying to say, then it helps you to decide what's important, what's not, what can I leave out, what's relevant. Okay, so here's my my little sketch. This helps me to define what my major shapes are. I use a piece of vine charcoal to do my initial sketch. Nice thing about waves, they're generally really easy to draw. So these little markers help because I can see that this line is about 2/3 of the way down between the top two marks, so it helps me to place the skyline. Just these reference marks really, really help. Okay, so the white starts over here. Gradually moves up this direction. This tells me where to lay in my underpainting colors. Okay, believe it or not, I'm done with my drawing. You don't have to draw that very much. Because all I'm trying to do is have a scheme for where I'm going to put my colors underneath. The next step is to lay in the colors. Really, if you get an underpainting done right, your work is so much easier. When you're painting waves and sand, the next step is to figure out what goes underneath all the whites. You don't look at any of the whites to figure out your choices. So, okay, first I'm going to put in some sky color. These colors look a little too bright to me, so I'm going to tone them down a little bit. I usually start from the top down because with pastel, it's dusty and it will fall down. Putting a little bit of purple underneath just as a sort of vibration color. Okay, background. I'm putting a very light layer on first, and you'll see what happens when I wet it down. A little bit of green in here as well. Move to a lighter blue in here. You want to go generally with the darkest shade you're going to use in your underpainting, and then you can layer colors on top, and it's much easier with water to put the darkest shades underneath, and then you're going to have reflections from the sky that you can drag on top, and that tends to work really well. So I like putting a little bit of this light green. It suggests the bubbles that are kind of pushing up underneath the water. And there's a slightly deeper green over here. I'm not going to worry about the whites because they're going to go on top. What I do see here, there's some shadows in here. This is foam, but it's foam and shadow, so it's sort of blue. There's so much white here. I'm going to leave this blank for now. I'm just going to cover that. No point in putting anything there yet. Okay, down here there's some more blues. And over there, I need to put in some more green. This gets greener up here. Okay, now, this is what I'm doing now. This is called an underpainting because I'm going to take rubbing alcohol and dissolve all this and create a solid layer. So it is literally a painting over which I will lay dry pastel. So I have to think about it as a setup for my painting. Now, the next step will be laying in what's going to go underneath all of the foam and then the wet sand. When you're choosing colors, when you have foam that you're painting underneath, so sometimes it's this kind of foam where it's, sitting over a couple of feet of water, and sometimes it's this sort of thing where it's really the kind of stuff that you're standing on the sand and the foam is just crashed right at your feet. So it's mainly on the sand. What's important when you're trying to figure out the color to use, ignore the whites of the foam because that goes on dry on top. For the underpainting, you want to use whatever color you see through the foam, the color of the sand underneath or the color of the water underneath. Just use that. Don't try to handle the foam yet because that's going to go on in a subsequent layer. So what I see underneath here is kind of a pretty blue over on this side. So you're laying in the groundwork. Gradually it changes from blue to something more like this, kind of a mauve. Wet sand is purpley. Okay, and then as the sand dries, it gets warmer. It goes from the cool purples, and then when it gets drier, it warms up to more russet colored. So right along this edge, it's more orangey, and then it's going to get a little lighter in value and a little golder. I'll use one of these. Now, this last color I've put on may end up being a little too yellow for this painting, but that's not a problem. It's just the underpainting. I can always just layer stuff on top of it, and that'll just show through a tiny bit underneath. Start with your lightest color on the board, because that way your alcohol stays clean. And I just noticed there's a little bit of a bluish shadow right in here, so I'm going to pick up some blue and add it in there. The 91%, if you're going to buy rubbing alcohol, dissolves the pastel more quickly and it dries more quickly than, say, the 70% or the 50%. So, but they all do work. You can also use water. You can also use a turpentine. You can use oil painting. You can do watercolor underpainting. This paper is extremely versatile. You can do an acrylic underpainting. Pastel is the same pigment that you find in watercolors and in oil paints. That when you wet it, it turns to paint. Mm-hmm. It's really the same thing as paint, which is one reason why this part is really fun. So this is really just a form of toning your paper. It's kind of a customized toning of the paper, and doing this just saves a whole lot of work. And it gives your painting a certain amount of depth and transparency, because you can really let some of this show through. You don't need to cover it all up if you get it right. I'm sort of doing a local color underpainting, so I'm doing colors that are very similar to what I'm putting on top. When I'm doing a landscape, I will often do complementary colors underneath. So, for instance, whenever I paint trees, I will generally use really dark reds wherever I've got dark green pine trees, because the dark red really adds depth and gives you kind of a visual vibration, color vibration with the greens that go on top, because trees aren't just green, and if you just put green down, they'll look flat. And for a green field, I will often start with a bright orange or a bright red, and then cover it with green, and you have little bits of the red showing through, and it just livens everything up. The last thing I want to do here before I begin painting is just restate a few lines. Okay, that's pretty clear where that is. I need to just get this line. So that's the water line there. Okay, so there's a big white area here. What I want to do is kind of just get a sense of movement where this goes. That goes there. And then the second large movement is across here. So if you do things right, then your underpainting works for you. You can already, even though it's very abstracted, you can already sort of see where it's going to go. Almost horizontal. Really important to get your angles right. This really has to lay almost flat for it to look realistic. A little bit of a bank of fog right along the horizon line, and that's very typical of what often happens on Nantucket. So I'm going to include that right along the horizon line. And it's always a little bit purple. So again, this is where familiarity with your subject comes in handy, because this is way too blue. But I know that that fog is often really purpley. I'm going to put a little purple in there. And then the color lifts a little just above that. A little bit of purple in it. Okay, I'm just going to knock that cloud back a little bit. The only place I really use my fingers to blend is in the sky. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Pastels are little crystals. So generally, if you blend too much with your fingers, you're dulling the colors. But especially for the first layer in the sky, you want the sky to go back in the distance. And then I might add a little more, but okay. You don't want a sharp edge at the horizon line because it'll bring it too far forward. So you're better off keeping your horizon kind of soft. Two things I do is soften the edge and lighten the value in the horizon line. Since it's got sort of a nice dark underpainting, I don't need to add all that much color here. I can just layer some color on here. And if you have a light touch, then it's not covering completely what's underneath it. You have some of the underpainting showing through. I want some more greens to show through. So I'm going to... You can change everything completely by the direction in which you hold it. This time I was holding my pastel horizontally, so I'm getting some horizontal streaks as opposed to holding it vertically and getting big wide strokes. You think about, if you're not a pastelist, think about this stick as maybe 6 different brushes. So you've got your long skinny strokes you can make. You've got your big wide strokes, and then depending on the pressure that you use, you can have a really light value, or you can have a really thick, heavy, or you can make all different shapes. I want to develop a little of this. The last thing you do is the whites, so that's going to come towards the end. Darker blues in here. A little distance to declare it finished. Putting on a slightly bluer color because I feel like I needed a little more of the reflection of a little more wetness, a little more reflection of the sky from down here. And the bluer you make it, the wetter it looks, because the more blue, it's reflecting the sky. If it's wet, it's reflecting the sky. If it's dry, it's the sand color. That's why it gets more purple if it's wet. So you can kind of get this magical sheen on the wet sand just by glazing a little bit of purple over it. And then right at the edge, it sort of gets a little sort of this darker reddish color. Now I'll go back to it. You notice if I don't like a color, I just adjust it. I don't worry about taking it off because it's not necessarily wrong, it's just going to add to what's already there. Unless it's way, way off, and then I would take a dry brush and just use this as an eraser. Okay, I do want a little bit of a grainy texture there. I might have to play with it a little bit, but okay. A little bit about whites. There's no such thing as actual white. There's yellow white, there's pink white, there's blue white. The yellow white is terrific for sunlight lighting up and hitting something really bright, especially if then the shadows are a little bit bluish or cool. So, and that's what I'm going to try to do here, because look at these, look how blue these shadows are. I'm just going to block in a little bit here. Adding the whites kind of makes everything kind of come to life a little bit. Okay, now, as it gets further back here, these whites aren't as bright. So I'm going to switch. I was using, this is the yellow white. I'm going to switch over and use a bluish white. I've got a couple of blue whites. I'm going to use, so look, it's subtle, but it does make a difference. Okay, let's see. This is going back here. Okay, now, and in here, it's quite blue. And in here, it's even darker blue. Now, this section gets a little lighter. I'm use a lighter. Now watch what happens if I just take this yellow for this edge right here.
So again, Jeanne, if you cover something and you feel that you've made a mistake, you can remove it with your dry brush, you said?
Yeah, like for instance, this area I didn't get as crisp. It was probably I had too much on there, and I want to make it a brighter yellow white. Just lift it right off. And then I can reapply the brighter yellow white. So I'm just starting to get, I had the big shapes on there, and now I'm just putting in a little, breaking it down into more detail. Whatever kind of wave you're painting, you want to apply the strokes in the direction the water is moving. Use the biggest strokes you possibly can. Okay, now that is too yellow, that color, so I'm going to correct it with a different pastel. I'm going to use a slightly pinker one on top. And then I'm going to transition to a bluer one. Because this stuff is just big solid shapes, whereas this is kind of complicated layers of and interlacing patterns. I do want to show you one other thing that can work really well though in this down here to help with these patterns. When you want to break things up, once you've got a decent amount built up, the advantage to the underpainting, so you can go in with a dry brush and kind of paint subtractively. So in here, where I see a lot more of the sand underneath, if the underpainting is the right color, you can just pick out little bits. Oh, you could restate, another color in there. Okay, so now I'm just going to go back in and restate a few of the wet sandy places in here where and that just helps with the look of the transparency. So I do want to get in this little wave up here in the corner. Scale is really important. This is far away. This one. Yeah. By the way, I didn't mention this, but I have this piece of paper towel, this square of paper towel sitting out here, and this isn't just to keep the table clean, it's my palette. So just like an oil painter has a palette, I keep my pastels for a specific painting out, because if you've ever worked with pastels, if you take one stick out, use it, it's the perfect stick, and then you put it right back again, then what happens when you need to use that stick again? You're never going to find it. So you keep them out in one spot, and you also, that way it keeps you from using too many pastels, because once your paper towel is so full of pastels you can't fit another one on there, you know you need to just look on your paper towel and not grab more. Just so here what I'm doing is adding a little bit of value back here. I haven't talked much about values, but in pastels you have to have a really good understanding of value, because you don't want to mix pastels of different value. Sometimes one of the biggest problems or difficulties that pastels run into is muddy colors and pastels that look chalky. That happens when you try to combine colors of different value, so really dark pastels with lighter pastels or vice versa. The way to avoid that, you can get away with mixing virtually any colors if you're using colors of equal value. There's a little bit more foam, a couple spots right back there, just for a little bit more. Okay. Maybe that piece, just a little bit more sheen in a lighter blue, in a more of a blue tone right in here. Okay, so that's enough for tonight. You're welcome.
Jeanne Smith has shown us how to create a dynamic wave painting in pastel. She first designs a strong composition, then lays in an underpainting with accurate values using an alcohol wash over a layer of dry pastel. With subsequent layers, she builds depth and atmospheric perspective for dramatic effects. Be sure to check Jeanne's website, jeannesmithart.com, for further examples of her fine work and to learn of upcoming shows and classes. Visit melrosearts.com for information about Melrose Arts, upcoming events, and future Art in Action demonstrations. Melrose Arts, dedicated to encouraging the visual arts in Melrose.